Karen Pemberton stared in absolute horror at her pristine silver BMW, now completely buried under what appeared to be half a mountain of gray gravel. Only the tip of her antenna poked through the rocky burial mound like a tiny metallic tombstone. "What?" She shrieked, her voice carrying across the entire Willowbrook Gardens subdivision at 7:23 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. Her perfectly manicured hands flew to her cheeks as she processed the impossible scene before her. Her car, her beautiful lease payment of $847 per month car, was entombed beneath enough gravel to pave a small parking lot. Neighbors began emerging from their houses like prairie dogs, drawn by Karen's increasingly hysterical wailing. Mrs. Chen from 1247. Oak Lane peeked over her fence, coffee mug in hand. The Johnson twins from across the street stood on their front porch in their pajamas, phones already out and recording. "My car!" Karen wailed again, her voice cracking. "Someone buried my car!" That's when Marcus Rodriguez stepped out of his house. At 1251 Oak Lane, wearing a satisfied grin and holding a steaming cup of coffee. He was a stocky man in his 40s with calloused hands and a contractor's tan. The kind of neighbor who fixed everything himself and never called the HOA for anything. "Morning, Karen," Marcus called out cheerfully, as if 10 tons of gravel hadn't mysteriously appeared overnight. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Karen's head snapped toward him, her eyes narrowing to laser-focused slits. In that moment, her attorney-trained mind began connecting dots at light speed. Marcus owned Rodriguez Landscaping. Marcus had access to industrial quantities of gravel. Marcus had been feuding with her for 3 months about her parking habits. And Marcus was standing there looking smugger than a cat who'd just discovered the canary cage was unlocked. "You!" She pointed a trembling French manicured finger at him. "You did this!" Marcus took a slow sip of his coffee, his dark eyes twinkling with mischief. "Did what, Karen? I'm just enjoying my morning coffee on my own property. Unlike some people around here, I respect property lines." The dig hit its mark. Karen's face flushed crimson, matching her silk blouse perfectly. For 3 months, she'd been parking her BMW partially on Marcus's driveway because her own driveway was too narrow for her taste. She'd dismissed his complaints, threatened him with HOA violations, and even called the police twice, both times resulting in officers politely explaining that she was, technically, the one trespassing. "This is destruction of property," Karen sputtered. "Vandalism! I'm calling the police!" "Go ahead," Marcus said, pulling out his own phone. "While you're at it, maybe mention how your car got onto my property in the first place." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. In her fury over the gravel, she'd momentarily forgotten that her BMW had been parked once again, with its rear bumper and trunk extending onto Marcus's driveway. She'd done it deliberately, of course. It was her little act of defiance against his unreasonable demands that she respect. "His property. That's completely different," she finally managed. "I was only using a tiny bit of your driveway." 6 feet, Marcus corrected. "You were using 6 feet of my driveway. I measured. Multiple times. I even drew you a diagram." The crowd of neighbors was growing. Karen could see Mrs. Patterson from the corner house whispering urgently into her phone, probably calling the other members of the HOA board. The Yamamoto family had come out with folding chairs as if settling in for a show. Even crotchety old Mr. Hendricks, who never spoke to anyone, was standing on his lawn with his arms crossed, wearing what might have been a smile. "You can't just bury someone's car in gravel," Karen shrieked. "Actually," Marcus said thoughtfully, "I can put whatever I want on my own property. That gravel, it's for a landscaping project I'm starting today. Funny coincidence that someone left their car right where I needed to dump it." Karen's legal mind began racing through possibilities. Surely there were laws about this. Surely you couldn't just... But even as she thought it, she realized the terrible genius of Marcus's move. He hadn't technically damaged her car. The gravel wasn't on her property. He'd simply placed building materials exactly where he had every right to place them. "This is harassment," she declared, pulling out her phone with shaking hands. "I'm documenting everything." "Good idea," Marcus agreed. "Make sure you get the property line in the shot. I had it surveyed last month, so we know exactly where my driveway ends and yours begins." As Karen fumbled with her phone's camera app, she caught sight of herself in the black screen. Her usually perfect blonde bob was disheveled. Her makeup was smeared from her earlier tears of rage, and her silk blouse was wrinkled from her dramatic gesturing. She looked unhinged. The realization hit her like a cold slap. She was the HOA, president of Willowbrook Gardens, a respected family law attorney, a woman who prided herself on maintaining perfect composure in all situations. And here she was, having a public meltdown over a parking dispute while half the neighborhood watched and recorded. Karen straightened her spine, smoothed her hair, and forced her voice into its courtroom calm register. "Mr. Rodriguez, I assume you'll be moving this material shortly?" "Oh, eventually," Marcus replied. "Probably take me a few days to get it all spread where I need it. Maybe a week. Depends on my schedule." "And my car? What about it?" Karen's eye twitched. "How am I supposed to get my car out?" Marcus shrugged. "Same way you got it there, I guess." Very carefully. The absurdity of the situation was starting to dawn on Karen. Her car was essentially trapped. She couldn't drive forward without scraping against his house's exterior wall. She couldn't reverse without plowing through a small mountain of gravel. And she couldn't exactly call a tow truck to dig out a buried BMW without looking completely ridiculous. "You're going to move that gravel right now," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Or I'm calling an emergency HOA meeting." Marcus's grin widened. Looking forward to it. "Should be interesting," explaining to the board. "How your car ended up on my property in the first place." Karen's hands clenched into fists. In her 38 years of life, she'd never met anyone who could make her lose control like this. Marcus Rodriguez was supposed to be intimidated by her position, her legal background, her authority as HOA president. Instead, he treated her like an amusing nuisance. The worst part was that he was right, and they both knew it. She'd been parking on his property for months, ignoring his increasingly frustrated requests to stop. She'd used her position as HOA president to deflect his complaints, threatening him with violation notices for trivial infractions while continuing her own trespassing. But this was war. "Fine," Karen said, her voice steady despite the rage boiling inside her. "You want to play games, Mr. Rodriguez? Let's play games." She turned on her heel and marched toward her front door, her high heels clicking against the pavement like gunshots. Behind her, she could hear the murmur of excited neighbors discussing the morning's entertainment. As she reached her door, Karen paused and looked back at Marcus, who was still standing there with his coffee, looking completely unperturbed by her threats. "Enjoy your coffee, Mr. Rodriguez," she called out sweetly. "It might be the last peaceful moment you have for a very long time." Marcus raised his mug in a mock toast. "Thanks, Karen. I plan to savor every drop." Karen slammed her front door hard enough to rattle the windows. Inside her pristine living room, she began pacing like a caged tiger, her mind already formulating plans. Marcus Rodriguez had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He'd escalated a simple parking dispute into something much bigger, much more personal. He thought he was clever, burying her car in gravel. He thought he'd won some kind of victory. What he didn't realize was that he'd just declared war on someone who'd spent 15 years practicing law, 7 years as HOA president, and 38 years perfecting the art of getting exactly what she wanted. Karen pulled out her phone and began scrolling through her contacts. She had calls to make, favors to collect, and a very detailed revenge to plan. Marcus Rodriguez was about to learn that you don't mess with Karen Pemberton. Outside, the gravel glinted in the morning sun, and somewhere beneath it, A BMW sat waiting to be freed. But Karen's car was the least of her concerns now. She had bigger prey to hunt. The war for 1251 Oak Lane was just beginning. 3 days later, Karen strode into the Willowbrook Gardens Community Center conference room like a general entering a battlefield. Her armor consisted of a Navy power suit, her weapon was a leather briefcase bulging with documents, and her strategy was 15 years of legal training combined with an intimate knowledge of every HOA bylaw ever written. The emergency board meeting she'd called was standing room only. Word of the great gravel incident had spread through the neighborhood faster than gossip at a church potluck. Residents who'd never shown interest in HOA politics were suddenly fascinated by municipal governance. Karen took her seat at the head of the rectangular table, flanking herself with the other board members. Janet Holbrook, a retired teacher who always supported Karen's initiatives, Bob Martinez, a nervous accountant who rarely disagreed with anyone, and Patricia Whitman, a sharp-eyed retiree who'd been Karen's only real opposition over the years. Marcus Rodriguez sat in the front row of folding chairs, wearing clean work clothes and the same infuriating calm expression he'd maintained since Tuesday morning. His car was parked legally in his own driveway, a fact that made Karen's jaw clench involuntarily. Her BMW, meanwhile, remained entombed in gravel. She'd been forced to rent a Honda Civic, just to maintain her daily routine. The indignity of it burned in her chest like heartburn. This emergency meeting of the Willowbrook Gardens Homeowners Association is now in session, Karen announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. We're here to address a serious violation of community standards and neighborly conduct. She opened her briefcase with practiced precision, removing a stack of papers thick enough to stop a bullet. Mr. Rodriguez, you stand accused of creating a public nuisance, disrupting neighborhood harmony, and engaging in harassment against a fellow resident. Marcus raised his hand like a student in elementary school. Point of order, Madam President. Karen's eye twitched. This isn't a courtroom, Mr. Rodriguez. You'll have your chance to speak. Actually, according to Robert's Rules of Order, which this HOA is bound to follow per our charter, any member may raise a point of order at any time. Marcus smiled pleasantly. I'd like to know exactly which HOA bylaws I've allegedly violated. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Karen hadn't expected Marcus to be familiar with parliamentary procedure. Most residents barely understood the difference between a motion and an amendment. The violations are clearly outlined in my complaint, Karen said, gesturing to her stack of papers. Noise disturbance, creation of unsightly conditions, and I'd like specific bylaw numbers, please, Marcus interrupted. Since this is an official proceeding and all. Karen's prepared speech ground to a halt. She'd been counting on intimidation and authority to carry the meeting. Having to cite specific violations was like being asked to show her math homework. Bylaw 4.7 prohibits any resident from creating conditions that negatively impact property values, she said, flipping through her papers. Your gravel display is clearly in violation of that standard. Actually, Patricia Whitman interjected, adjusting her reading glasses. Bylaw 4.7 specifically exempts landscaping materials stored for active construction projects. I assume Mr. Rodriguez has proper permits? Marcus reached into his shirt pocket and produced a folded paper. Building permit for a retaining wall and drainage system, approved by both the county and the HOA Architectural Committee, filed 2 months ago. The air in the room shifted perceptibly. Karen could feel her narrative slipping away like sand through her fingers. This wasn't how the meeting was supposed to go. Marcus was supposed to be defensive, apologetic, maybe even remorseful. Instead, he was systematically dismantling her case with paperwork and parliamentary procedure. The location of the materials is the issue, Karen pressed on. Dumping 10 tons of gravel directly behind someone's car is harassment, pure and simple. Where exactly did I dump this gravel? Marcus asked innocently. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. The truth was that Marcus had dumped the gravel entirely on his own property. She couldn't claim otherwise without lying outright in front of 43 witnesses. "You knew my car was there," she said instead. "You deliberately trapped it." "Your car was illegally parked on my property," Marcus replied. "I have photographs documenting 3 months of trespassing, along with certified mail receipts showing multiple requests for you to stop." He produced another stack of papers, this one considerably more organized than Karen's. Time-stamped photos showed her BMW in various positions, all clearly extending onto his driveway. The certified mail receipts were marked "Refuse to accept" in Karen's own handwriting. The crowd was murmuring more loudly now. Karen could feel the mood shifting against her. These people had watched her park illegally for months. They'd seen her dismiss Marcus's complaints. Now she was trying to paint herself as the victim. "Furthermore," Marcus continued, "I'd like to file a formal complaint against Ms. Pemberton for chronic trespassing, abuse of her position as board president, and selective enforcement of HOA rules." Karen shot to her feet. "You can't file a complaint against the president during a meeting about your violations?" "Actually," Patricia said, consulting a thick binder, "any member may file a complaint at any time. It's right here in Section 2.3 of our procedures manual." The walls felt like they were closing in. Karen had called this meeting to destroy Marcus Rodriguez's reputation and force him to remove his gravel. Instead, she was being systematically outmaneuvered by a landscaper with a high school education. "Mrs. Pemberton," called out a voice from the back of the room. Karen turned to see Mrs. Chen raising her hand. "Can you explain why my request to repaint my front door was denied, but your request to install that decorative fountain was approved in the same week?" More hands went up around the room. Karen realized with growing horror that Marcus's counterattack had opened floodgates she'd kept firmly closed for years. "My fence repair application sat on your desk for 6 weeks, added Tom Yamamoto. "But when your friend Janet wanted to install that gazebo, it was approved overnight." Janet Holbrook shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her usual loyalty to Karen wavering under the scrutiny of 43 sets of eyes. "Those are separate issues," Karen said, her voice rising defensively. "We're here to discuss Mr. Rodriguez's violations." "Are we?" Patricia asked, flipping through the meeting agenda Karen had prepared. "Because according to this, we're here to address serious violations of community standards. Seems to me that selective rule enforcement qualifies." Karen felt sweat beading on her forehead despite the air conditioning. The meeting had completely spiraled out of her control. What was supposed to be a public shaming of Marcus Rodriguez had turned into an impromptu audit of her 7-year presidency. "I move that we table Ms. Pemberton's complaint pending a full investigation of HOA governance practices," Patricia announced. "I second that motion," said Bob Martinez, speaking up for the first time all evening. Karen's heart sank. A seconded motion had to be voted on, and with Patricia and Bob already committed, she needed Janet's vote to maintain control. "All in favor?" Patricia called out. Patricia and Bob raised their hands immediately. After a long moment, Janet reluctantly followed suit. "Motion carries," Patricia announced. "Ms. Pemberton's complaint is tabled pending investigation." The crowd erupted in excited chatter. Karen stood frozen at the head of the table, watching 7 years of carefully constructed authority crumble around her. She'd never lost a board vote before, ever. "Furthermore," Patricia continued, "I move that we establish a committee to review HOA governance practices and investigate allegations of selective enforcement." "Seconded," Bob said quickly. Karen wanted to object, to maintain some control over the situation, but parliamentary procedure was a trap she'd fallen into willingly. As president, she had to follow the rules she'd used to steamroll residents for years. "All in favor?" 3 hands went up again. Karen's didn't move. Motion carries. The committee will consist of 3 volunteers from the general membership. Patricia looked out at the crowd. "Do I have volunteers?" A dozen hands shot up instantly. Karen watched in growing panic as her neighbors eagerly volunteered to investigate her conduct. These were people she'd dismissed, ignored, and overruled for years. Now they were forming a committee to examine every decision she'd made. "Mr. Rodriguez," Patricia said, "would you be willing to serve on the Governance Review Committee?" Marcus stood up slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I'd be honored to serve the community in that capacity." The crowd applauded. Karen gritted, her teeth so hard she thought her molars might crack. Not only had Marcus escaped consequences for his gravel stunt, he'd somehow maneuvered himself into a position to investigate her. "Excellent," Patricia said. "Mrs. Chen and Mr. Yamamoto, would you complete the committee?" Both neighbors accepted enthusiastically. Karen realized she was looking at three people whose complaints she'd dismissed or delayed over the years. They'd just been handed official authority to examine her conduct as president. "The committee will have full access to HOA records and decision-making documentation," Patricia announced. "First meeting will be next Tuesday at 7 p.m. Karen finally found her voice. "As president, I maintain executive privilege over confidential board discussions." Karen spent the weekend in her home office, surrounded by boxes of HOA documents dating back 7 years. Coffee cups and energy drink cans littered her desk like casualties from a caffeine war. Her usually immaculate house looked like a tornado had hit a law library. She was building her defense. Every rejected application, every delayed approval, every seemingly arbitrary decision, Karen was constructing justifications for all of it. She had to be ready for Tuesday's committee meeting, had to control the narrative before Marcus and his allies painted her as some kind of tyrannical dictator. The truth was more complicated than that. Yes, she'd been strict. Yes, she'd sometimes prioritized certain residents over others. But everything she'd done had been for the good of the community. Property values in Willowbrook Gardens had increased 23% during her tenure as president. The neighborhood was pristine, organized, harmonious. Well, it had been harmonious until Marcus Rodriguez showed up with his gravel and his parliamentary procedure. By Sunday evening, Karen had created a comprehensive portfolio defending every controversial decision she'd made. Each rejection letter was paired with photographic evidence of why the request would have harmed neighborhood aesthetics. Each approval was supported by property value analysis and community impact studies she'd hastily cobbled together from real estate websites. She was particularly proud of her response to the fence color controversy from 2023. Mrs. Patterson had wanted to paint her privacy fence forest green instead of the HOA-mandated colonial white. Karen had rejected the request, leading to a heated argument at the July board meeting. Now she had 17 pages of documentation proving that non-standard fence colors could reduce property values by up to 3%. Of course, the fact that Karen's own fence featured decorative iron accents that weren't technically HOA approved was a detail she hoped the committee wouldn't discover. Monday morning arrived with an unwelcome surprise. Karen was checking her mail when she noticed a small crowd gathered around Marcus's house. Her stomach dropped as she saw what they were looking at. The gravel pile was gone. Her BMW sat in Marcus's driveway, gleaming silver and completely undamaged, as if the entire burial incident had been a strange dream. But that wasn't the surprising part. The surprising part was the professional-looking crew installing what appeared to be a sophisticated drainage system exactly where the gravel had been. Marcus wasn't just removing evidence of his prank, he was actually completing the landscaping project he'd claimed to be working on. "Son of a bitch," Karen muttered under her breath. She marched across the street, her heels clicking aggressively against the asphalt. Marcus was standing near his front door, consulting what looked like architectural blueprints with a man in a hard hat. "Mr. Rodriguez," Karen called out in her most professional voice, "I see you've decided to remove the public nuisance from your property." Marcus looked up from his blueprints, that same infuriating, calm smile on his face. "Morning, Karen. Just Getting started on the project I pulled permits for. Should be done by the end of the week. The man in the hard hat looked between them with obvious interest. Karen realized she was once again making a scene in front of witnesses, but she couldn't help herself. How convenient that you decided to move forward with construction right before the committee meeting, she said. Actually, Marcus replied, this was always the timeline. You can check with the permit office if you want. I scheduled the crew 2 months ago. Karen felt her carefully constructed narrative beginning to crack. If Marcus could prove he'd planned legitimate construction all along, then his gravel stunt looked less like harassment and more like, well, exactly what he'd claimed it was. Coincidental timing involving legally stored building materials. Your car's in your driveway, Marcus added helpfully. Fully accessible. I even had it washed. Karen looked over at her BMW gleaming under the morning sun. It looked better than it had before the gravel incident. She couldn't claim property damage. She couldn't claim ongoing harassment. She couldn't even claim that her car was still trapped. Marcus had systematically removed every legal and practical complaint she might have had against him. This doesn't change anything, Karen said, though even she could hear how weak that sounded. Doesn't change what? Marcus asked. You've got your car back. I'm completing my permitted construction project, and the neighborhood gets improved drainage. Seems like everybody wins. The workers were already making impressive progress. What had looked like a vindictive gravel dump on Tuesday now clearly resembled the foundation for a sophisticated stormwater management system. Karen could even see how it would benefit the entire street during heavy rains. She stood there for a long moment watching Marcus direct the construction with obvious expertise. This wasn't some random landscaper who'd gotten lucky with permits. This was a professional contractor who'd planned every detail of his project months in advance. The realization hit her like a cold slap. She'd been outplayed from the very beginning. Marcus had never been angry about her parking on his driveway. He'd been documenting it. Every polite request, every certified letter, every photograph had been part of building a legal case. The gravel incident wasn't emotional retaliation. It was strategic positioning. He'd known she would escalate. He'd known she would call an emergency board meeting. He'd known exactly how she would react, and he'd prepared for every move. See you tomorrow night, Karen, Marcus said, returning to his blueprints. Looking forward to the committee meeting. Karen turned and walked back to her house in stunned silence. For the first time in years, she felt completely outmatched. Tuesday evening arrived faster than Karen wanted. She'd spent the day reviewing her defense materials one final time, but her confidence was shaken. The sight of Marcus's legitimate construction project had forced her to confront an uncomfortable truth. Maybe she really had been wrong about the parking situation. The committee meeting was held in the community center's smaller conference room. Unlike Friday's packed emergency session, this was a more intimate affair. Just Karen, the 3 committee members, and a handful of residents who'd specifically requested to provide testimony. Marcus arrived precisely on time, carrying a neat folder of documents. Mrs. Chen and Mr. Yamamoto flanked him, both looking serious and prepared. These weren't angry neighbors looking for revenge. They were residents conducting legitimate oversight of their elected representative. Good evening, everyone, Mrs. Chen said, calling the meeting to order. We're here to review allegations of selective enforcement and procedural irregularities in HOA governance. Karen had prepared an opening statement, but Mrs. Chen's businesslike tone threw her off balance. She'd expected hostility, anger, maybe even personal attacks. Instead, she was facing what appeared to be a professional investigation. Mrs. Pemberton, Mr. Yamamoto said, "We've reviewed the documentation you provided. It's very thorough. However, we have some questions about specific decisions and timelines." For the next hour, the committee methodically walked through Karen's 7-year tenure as president. They asked about approval timelines, decision criteria, communication protocols. Their questions were pointed but fair, their tone respectful, but persistent. Karen found herself defending decisions she'd barely remembered making. The purple mailbox incident from 2021. The unauthorized bird feeder controversy of 2022. The great mulch color debate that had consumed 3 board meetings. In 2023. Individually, each decision seemed reasonable. Collectively, they painted a picture of increasingly arbitrary rule enforcement focused more on Karen's personal aesthetic preferences than community standards. Let's talk about communication protocols, Marcus said, consulting his notes. How many times did you respond to my parking concerns before I filed the certified letters? Karen felt her chest tighten. I responded to all legitimate complaints through proper channels. Could you define proper channels for us? Mrs. Chen asked. Board meetings, official correspondence, documented violations, but not direct. Resident-to-resident communication? Mr. Yamamoto pressed. Karen realized she was walking into a trap. I maintain professional boundaries between my role as president and my personal relationships with neighbors. Marcus pulled out a stack of papers. These are phone records showing 17 calls I made to your listed number over 3 months. None were returned. These are emails sent to your HOA address. None received responses. These are certified. Letters sent to your home. All marked, refuse to accept. The evidence was damning. Karen had systematically ignored Marcus's attempts at communication, forcing him to escalate to increasingly formal channels. She'd created the very conflict she was now claiming to be a victim of. Why did you refuse to accept the certified letters? Mrs. Chen asked. Karen's mouth went dry. The honest answer was that she'd hoped to avoid creating a paper trail that might be used against her later. But she couldn't say that without admitting she'd known her parking was problematic. I felt they were unnecessary escalation, she said, instead. The matter could have been resolved through normal neighborly discussion. But you weren't available for normal neighborly discussion, Marcus pointed out. You didn't return calls, answer emails, or accept certified mail. What options? Did that leave me? Karen felt the walls closing in. Every answer she gave seemed... The committee's report arrived in Karen's email at exactly 11:47 p.m. on Sunday, 24 hours before Monday's board meeting as promised. She'd been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling and rehearsing her resignation speech, when her phone buzzed with the message notification. 47 pages. The committee had written a 47-page report about her conduct as HOA president. Karen sat up in bed and began reading, her heart sinking with each paragraph. The committee had been thorough, professional, and absolutely devastating. They'd documented 73 instances of selective rule enforcement, 18 violations of proper procedure, and 12 cases of what they diplomatically termed communication failures. The parking dispute with Marcus was just the final straw in a pattern of behavior that dated back to Karen's first year as president. They'd interviewed 26 residents, reviewed hundreds of documents, and cross-referenced every major decision she'd made in 7 years. The most damning section was titled Executive Overreach and Democratic Deficit. The committee had discovered that Karen had been making unilateral decisions and presenting them to the board as foregone conclusions. She'd bypassed community input on major policy changes, ignored resident complaints, and used her legal background to intimidate anyone who questioned her authority. But it wasn't just criticism. The report also acknowledged Karen's accomplishments: improved property values, successful capital projects, and generally effective community management. The committee had been fair, even generous in some assessments, which somehow made it worse. Karen could have dismissed a partisan hit job. But this was a balanced professional evaluation that concluded she'd lost sight of her role as an elected representative of her neighbors' interests. The recommendations section was brief but decisive. Immediate implementation of new governance, procedures, mandatory board training on democratic processes, and a formal censure of Karen's conduct. They stopped short of recommending her removal, but the message was crystal clear. Karen's way of doing business was over. She closed her laptop and sat in the darkness of her bedroom, feeling something she hadn't experienced in years. Genuine uncertainty about what came next. Monday evening's board meeting was standing room only again. Word of the committee's report had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Karen arrived early, hoping to maintain some semblance of control over the proceedings, but she could feel the shift in atmosphere immediately. Residents who'd barely acknowledged her existence for years were making eye contact, their expressions ranging from disappointment to outright hostility. The Yamamoto family sat in the front row, arms crossed. Mrs. Patterson whispered urgently to a cluster of neighbors in the back. Even Janet Holbrook, Karen's longtime ally, seemed to be avoiding her gaze. Marcus Rodriguez entered the room precisely at 7 o'clock, carrying the same neat folder he'd brought to the committee meeting. He nodded politely to Karen as he took his seat, showing no trace of vindictiveness or gloating. Somehow, his professional courtesy made Karen feel even worse than open hostility would have. This meeting of the Willowbrook Gardens Board is now in session, Karen announced, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. We'll begin with the presentation of the Governance Review Committee's findings. Mrs. Chen stood up, holding a bound copy of the report. Thank you, Madam President. The committee has completed a comprehensive review of HOA governance practices over the past 7 years. Our findings are detailed in this report, which has been distributed to all board members and is available for public review. What followed was the most professionally brutal 20 minutes of Karen's life. Mrs. Chen presented the committee's findings with clinical precision, her tone respectful but uncompromising. She cited specific examples, referenced documented evidence, and methodically dismantled 7 years of Karen's leadership. The parking dispute with Marcus was presented as a case study in everything that had gone wrong with Karen's approach to governance. Her refusal to engage in direct communication, her use of procedural barriers to avoid addressing legitimate complaints, her escalation of a simple neighbor-to-neighbor issue into a full-blown community crisis. The committee recognizes Mrs. Pemberton's many contributions to our community, Mrs. Chen concluded. Property values have increased significantly during her tenure, and several major infrastructure projects have been completed successfully. However, we've identified systematic patterns of behavior that are incompatible with effective democratic governance. Karen felt like she was attending her own professional funeral. Every accomplishment was acknowledged briefly, then buried under an avalanche of documented failures. The committee had been so thorough that even she couldn't argue with their conclusions. When Mrs. Chen finished her presentation, the room fell silent. All eyes turned to Karen, waiting for her response. She'd prepared a defense, a detailed rebuttal to the committee's findings. 43 pages of legal arguments, procedural justifications, and character testimonials. But sitting there under the weight of her neighbor's stare, Karen realized that no amount of legal maneuvering could change the fundamental truth of what had happened. She'd lost sight of who she was supposed to be serving. I've reviewed the committee's report, Karen said slowly, setting aside her prepared remarks. Their documentation is thorough and their findings are fair. A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. They'd expected her to fight, to deny, to lawyer her way out of accountability. I became HOA president because I wanted to serve this community, Karen continued. I believed that strong leadership required making difficult decisions, sometimes unpopular ones. I thought that my legal background and attention to detail would help us maintain high standards and protect property values. She paused, looking out at faces she'd known for 7 years, some angry, some disappointed, some simply waiting to hear what she'd say next. What I lost sight of, Karen admitted, was that leadership in a community like this isn't about being the smartest person in the room or having all the answers. It's about listening to your neighbors, respecting their concerns, and finding solutions that work for everyone. The room was completely silent now. Even Marcus looked surprised by the direction of Karen's response. The committee is right about the parking situation with Mr. Rodriguez, Karen said, her voice growing stronger. He tried to resolve the issue through normal channels. He called, he emailed, he sent certified letters. I ignored all of those attempts at communication because I thought I knew better, because I thought my convenience mattered more than his property rights. She turned to look directly at Marcus. I was wrong, and I owe you an apology. Not just for parking on your property, but for dismissing your concerns and forcing you to take increasingly dramatic steps just to get my attention. Marcus nodded acknowledgement, his expression unreadable. The gravel incident, Karen continued, was the inevitable result of my failure to engage in good faith with a legitimate complaint. Mr. Rodriguez didn't bury my car out of spite. He created a situation that forced me to confront the consequences of my behavior. Karen stood up, feeling lighter somehow than she had in weeks. I accept the committee's recommendations for improved governance procedures and board training. I also think it's time for new leadership in this community. The crowd stirred with anticipation. Karen pulled a folded paper from her jacket pocket. Effective immediately, I'm resigning as president of the Willowbrook Gardens Homeowners Association. The room erupted in surprised chatter. Board members, Janet, Bob, and Patricia looked shocked. This wasn't the defiant last stand they'd expected from Karen Pemberton. I'll remain on the board until my term expires in November, but I'm stepping down from the executive position, Karen continued. Patricia Whitman has more institutional knowledge than anyone, and I believe she'd serve this community well as interim president. Patricia looked stunned. Karen, That's not necessary. We can work through these issues. No, Karen said, firmly. The committee is right. I've lost the trust of too many residents. The community deserves leadership that reflects its values, not my personal preferences. As the meeting continued with the formal acceptance of Karen's resignation and Patricia's appointment as interim president, Karen felt an unexpected sense of relief. The weight of constantly defending her decisions, of managing every detail of community life, lifted from her shoulders. During the public comment period, something remarkable happened. Residents began speaking not just about their frustrations with Karen's leadership, but about their appreciation for her dedication. Mrs. Patterson thanked her for the playground renovation project. Bob Yamamoto praised her handling of the storm, damage repairs from 2022. Even some of her harshest critics acknowledged that her intentions had been good, even when her methods were flawed. Marcus was the last to speak. I want to say something about Mrs. Pemberton's apology, he began, standing up slowly. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, especially in front of 40 people who've been criticizing you for weeks. He looked directly at Karen. I never wanted to be your enemy. I just wanted you to respect my property rights. What happened with the gravel? That was me getting frustrated and maybe a little creative. But I never wanted to destroy your car or humiliate you. 3 weeks after her resignation, Karen stood in her kitchen making coffee and watching Marcus Rodriguez through her window. He was in his driveway again, but this time he wasn't working on drainage systems or burying cars in gravel. He was talking to a steady stream of neighbors who kept stopping by his house like pilgrims visiting a shrine. Mrs. Chen had been there for 20 minutes yesterday, taking notes in a small leather journal. The Yamamoto family had stopped by with their kids who'd played in Marcus's front yard while the adults talked seriously on his porch. Even crusty old Mr. Hendricks, who'd spoken to maybe 5 people in the 10 years Karen had known him, had spent an entire afternoon helping Marcus install what looked like a small community bulletin board near his mailbox. Karen sipped her coffee and tried to convince herself she wasn't spying. She was just observing. As a former HOA president, she had a natural interest in community dynamics. It wasn't personal, except it was becoming increasingly personal. Patricia Whitman had been doing an admirable job as interim president, but it was becoming clear that she viewed the position as temporary caretaking rather than active leadership. The next HOA election was scheduled for November, just 2 months away, and Patricia had already announced she wouldn't be seeking a full term, which left the field wide open for someone with ambition, community support, and a proven ability to organize residents around shared goals. Someone exactly like Marcus Rodriguez. Karen's phone buzzed with a text message from Janet Holbrook. "Coffee this morning? Need to discuss something important." They met at the Starbucks outside Willowbrook. Gardens, neutral territory where they could talk without being overheard by neighbors. Janet looked nervous, fidgeting with her napkin and glancing around like she expected surveillance. "Marcus is running for president," Janet said without preamble. Karen felt her stomach drop, though she'd been expecting this news for weeks. "Has he announced officially?" "Not yet, but he's been making the rounds, talking to residents, building support, putting together what looks like a platform." Janet leaned forward conspiratorially. "Karen, he's good at this, really good. He knows everybody's concerns, he has solutions prepared, and people trust him." "What does this have to do with me?" Karen asked, though she had a sinking feeling she already knew. "You need to run against him." Karen nearly choked on her coffee. "Janet, I resigned in disgrace 3 weeks ago. Half the neighborhood thinks I'm a dictator." "The other half thinks you were an effective leader who made some mistakes," Janet countered. "People have short memories, and Marcus isn't as perfect as he seems. You know this community better than anyone. You understand the legal complexities, the budget issues, the long-term planning requirements. I lost the trust of the residents." "You lost their patience with your methods," Janet corrected. "But they never doubted your dedication or competence. Marcus has charisma and popular support, but he's never managed a budget, never dealt with county bureaucrats, never handled a major infrastructure project." Karen stirred her coffee thoughtfully. The idea was simultaneously appealing and terrifying. She'd spent the past 3 weeks feeling like a deposed monarch, watching from the sidelines as her former kingdom moved on without her. The prospect of returning to active leadership was intoxicating, but it was also potentially disastrous. Another public conflict with Marcus could destroy what little reputation she had left. "What makes you think I could win?" Karen asked. Janet smiled. "Because I know you, Karen. You don't like losing, and you especially don't like losing to someone who outmaneuvered you as thoroughly as Marcus did." That evening, Karen found herself walking the neighborhood streets she'd governed for 7 years. She told herself she was just getting exercise, but her route seemed to take her past the homes of residents she'd had conflicts with over the years. The purple mailbox that had caused such controversy in 2021 was still there, faded now, but oddly charming against the house's white siding. The unauthorized garden gnome collection that had generated 17 complaint calls was still arranged cheerfully along the Hendersons' front walkway. The decorative wind chimes that had violated noise ordinances were still hanging from Mrs. Patterson's porch, creating gentle music in the evening breeze. None of these violations had destroyed property values or ruined neighborhood aesthetics. In fact, they added character to what might otherwise be a sterile suburban landscape. Karen began to wonder how many battles she'd fought over issues that simply didn't matter. Her walk took her past Marcus's house, where the community bulletin board was already being put to good use. Someone had posted a notice about a lost cat. Another resident was offering tutoring services. A third had posted information about a community garden project. It was exactly the kind of informal neighborhood communication that Karen had always tried to channel through official HOA processes. But seeing it in action, she had to admit it seemed to be working pretty well without bureaucratic oversight. "Evening, Karen." She turned to find Marcus emerging from his backyard wearing work clothes and carrying a toolbox. He looked genuinely pleased to see her, which somehow made her feel worse about spying on his political activities. "Marcus, nice bulletin board." "Thanks. Figured it might help people connect with each other more easily." He set down his toolbox and gestured toward the board. "Already getting more use than I expected." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both looking at the collection of community notices. Karen found herself wondering if this was Marcus's version of a campaign photo op, letting a potential opponent see the grassroots support he was building. "Janet thinks you're planning to run for HOA president," Karen said, deciding on directness. Marcus smiled. "Janet thinks a lot of things. What do you think?" "I think you'd be good at it. You've proven you can organize residents around shared concerns. You understand the importance of communication and consensus building. You have the community's trust." "That's generous of you to say." Karen studied his face, looking for some clue about his real intentions. "Are you going to run?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. "I've been thinking about it," he admitted. "A lot of people have asked me to consider it. They seem to think the community needs someone who'll take a different approach to leadership." "Different from me, you mean?" "Different from the way things have been done, yes." Marcus's tone was careful, not wanting to insult her. "More collaborative, maybe. More focused on bringing people together instead of managing them." Karen felt a familiar spark of competitive fire. "And you think you can do that better than someone with 7 years of experience and a law degree?" Marcus grinned, recognizing the challenge in her voice. "I think experience can be an asset or a liability, depending on what lessons you've learned from it." "Meaning?" "Meaning someone who's learned from their mistakes might be exactly what this community needs." Karen stared at him, trying to decode the message behind his words. Was he suggesting she should run again? Was this some kind of political chess move designed to draw her into a race he was confident he could win? Or was he genuinely suggesting that her experience, combined with the humility she'd gained from recent events, might make her a better leader than she'd been before? "I should get home," Karen said, unsettled by the direction of her own thoughts. "Karen," Marcus called as she started to walk away. "For what it's worth, I meant what I said at the board meeting. This community has been well managed under your leadership. The big picture stuff, the long-term planning, the financial management, you've done good work. But maybe good management isn't the same thing as good leadership." Karen walked, home with Marcus's words echoing in her head. The distinction he'd drawn was subtle but important. She'd been an effective manager, enforcing rules, maintaining standards, executing projects. But leadership required something more: inspiring trust, building consensus, bringing out the best in people instead of just demanding compliance. Back. In her house, Karen sat down at her computer and began researching Marcus Rodriguez more thoroughly than she ever had before. If she was going to consider running against him, she needed to understand exactly who she'd be facing. What she discovered was both impressive and concerning. Marcus owned a successful landscaping business that employed 12 people and had been growing steadily for 8 years. He'd completed projects for 3 other HOAs in the area, all with glowing recommendations. His Better Business Bureau rating was perfect. More importantly, his approach to business seemed to mirror his approach to neighborhood politics. Customer reviews consistently mentioned his ability to listen to their concerns, suggest creative solutions, and deliver results that exceeded expectations. He was described as professional, reliable, and easy to work with. In other words, he possessed all the interpersonal skills that Karen had never quite mastered. But as Karen dug deeper, she found some interesting details. Marcus had been involved in a zoning dispute with the county 2 years ago, fighting to expand his business operations. The case had been settled quietly, but Karen's legal training allowed her to read between the lines of the public records. Marcus wasn't just a small business owner, he was someone with bigger ambitions who'd learned how to navigate bureaucratic systems when necessary. His neighborhood political activity. Karen's campaign began at 5:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning with a knock on Mrs. Patterson's door. She stood on the front porch holding a thermos of coffee and a clipboard, wearing her most approachable smile and a carefully chosen outfit that said, "Competent but not intimidating." Mrs. Patterson answered the door in a bathrobe, looking suspicious and slightly alarmed. "Karen, what are you doing here?" "I wanted to apologize," Karen said simply. "Not just for the fence color controversy, but for the way I handled your concerns. You deserved better communication and more respect for your input." Mrs. Patterson blinked in surprise. In 7 years of neighborhood disputes, Karen had never apologized for anything. "I'm considering running for HOA president again," Karen continued, "but this time I want to do it differently. I want to start by listening to residents' concerns instead of assuming I know what's best for everyone." "You're running against Marcus?" Karen nodded. "If residents will give me another chance to serve them." Mrs. Patterson studied Karen's face, looking for signs of the arrogance and dismissiveness that had characterized their previous interactions. Instead, she saw something she'd never seen before: genuine humility. "Come in," Mrs. Patterson said, stepping aside. "Let's talk." Over the next 3 hours, Karen had the most productive conversation she'd ever had with Mrs. Patterson. They discussed the fence color issue, but also broader questions about community aesthetics, property rights, and the balance between standards and individual expression. Karen discovered that Mrs. Patterson wasn't opposed to community standards. She just wanted more flexibility in how they were applied. The forest green fence wasn't about rebellion. It was about creating a backdrop for her prize-winning rose garden that would make the flowers pop more dramatically. By the time Karen left, she had not only Mrs. Patterson's tentative support, but also a deeper understanding of how her rule-focused approach had missed opportunities for creative solutions that could satisfy both community standards and individual preferences. More importantly, she had the beginning of a campaign platform that went beyond just, "I'll do better this time." Over the following days, Karen continued her door-to-door apology tour. She visited every resident she'd had conflicts with over the years, armed with coffee, genuine contrition, and careful questions designed to understand their perspectives. The Yamamoto family taught her about the cultural significance of their garden design that she'd nearly forced them to change. Mrs. Chen explained how the delayed mailbox repair had affected her elderly mother's ability to collect her medications safely. The Henderson family showed her how their garden gnome collection had become a neighborhood attraction that brought joy to children walking to school. Each conversation was a masterclass in empathy that Karen's legal training had never provided. She began to understand that effective leadership wasn't about having all the answers. It was about asking better questions. Meanwhile, Marcus was conducting his own campaign, though his approach was characteristically different. Instead of door-to-door visits, he organized community events: a neighborhood cleanup day that drew 30 volunteers, a barbecue in the Bee Park that brought together families who'd barely spoken to each other before, a town hall meeting focused on resident priorities for the coming year. Karen had to admit his events were brilliant political theater. People left feeling energized and connected to their community, viewing Marcus as the person who'd brought them together. It was exactly the kind of grassroots organizing that Karen had never been good at. But as she watched Marcus's campaign unfold, Karen began to notice something interesting. His events were heavy on inspiration and community building, but light on specifics. He talked about collaborative leadership and resident-focused governance without explaining exactly what that would look like in practice. When asked about budget priorities, Marcus spoke eloquently about the need to balance fiscal responsibility with community investment. When questioned about specific policy proposals, he emphasized the importance of community input in the decision-making process. It wasn't that he was being evasive. Marcus clearly had strong instincts about leadership and community building. But Karen's analytical mind began to suspect that his campaign was long on vision and short on implementation details, which gave her an idea. 2 weeks before the election, Karen requested time at the monthly board meeting to present her campaign platform. Patricia Whitman, still serving as interim president, agreed to give both candidates 15 minutes to address the community. Karen had spent days preparing her presentation, but not in the way she'd prepared for meetings in the past. Instead of focusing on her qualifications and accomplishments, she'd developed a detailed policy platform based on everything she'd learned during her apology tour. "I'm asking for your votes not because I deserve them," Karen began, "but because I've learned something important about leadership from the mistakes I made as your president." She outlined specific policy proposals, flexible aesthetic guidelines that allowed for individual expression within community standards, streamlined communication processes that encouraged resident input, and regular town halls where neighbors could address concerns directly with board members. "I understand that some of you are skeptical about giving me another chance," Karen continued. "You have every right to be, but I'm not the same leader who resigned 3 months ago. I've learned the difference between managing a community and serving one." Then she did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She invited questions from the audience, promising to answer them directly and specifically. For the next 20 minutes, Karen fielded questions about everything from budget priorities to landscaping policies. Her answers were detailed, practical, and reflected a deep understanding of both the community's needs and the practical challenges of HOA governance. When Mrs. Chen asked about communication protocols, Karen outlined a specific system for ensuring resident concerns would be addressed within 48 hours. When Mr. Yamamoto questioned her commitment to inclusive decision-making, Karen proposed quarterly resident surveys and mandatory community input periods for all major decisions. Marcus followed with his own presentation, and it was everything Karen expected: inspiring, community-focused, and diplomatically vague about specifics. He spoke eloquently about bringing neighbors together and creating a more collaborative approach to governance. When residents asked him detailed questions about implementation, Marcus emphasized the importance of community consensus and working together to develop solutions. It was a perfectly reasonable approach, but it left many specific questions unanswered. As the meeting concluded, Karen could sense a shift in the room's energy. Residents who'd been skeptical about her candidacy seemed genuinely intrigued by her detailed policy proposals. People who'd been enthusiastic about Marcus's community-building vision appeared to be wondering about the practical aspects of his leadership. The race was becoming competitive in ways that neither candidate had initially expected. Over the final 2 weeks of the campaign, both candidates intensified their efforts. Marcus organized more community events, focusing on his strengths in bringing people together and creating positive energy around neighborhood activities. Karen continued her door-to-door campaign, but now she was armed with specific policy proposals tailored to individual resident concerns. She promised Mrs. Patterson a new aesthetic guidelines committee that would include resident representatives. She assured the Yamamoto family that cultural considerations would be explicitly included in landscaping standards. The contrast between the candidates became increasingly clear. Marcus offered inspiration and community connection. Karen offered detailed plans and practical solutions. Both approaches had merit, and both candidates had genuine support among residents. But as Election Day approached, Karen began to sense something she hadn't expected: momentum. Neighbors who'd been politely non-committal during her early apology visits were now engaging in substantive conversations about her policy proposals. Residents who'd seemed certain to vote for Marcus were asking detailed questions about his implementation plans. The night before the election, Karen sat in her home office reviewing her campaign materials one final time. She'd run a very different campaign than any she'd ever imagined, focused on listening rather than persuading, on specific solutions rather than general promises, on earning trust rather than demanding respect. Whether it would be enough to overcome 3 months of negative associations and Marcus's considerable natural advantages remained to be seen. But for the first time since the gravel incident, Karen felt like she was running a campaign she could be proud of regardless of the outcome. She'd rediscovered what had originally motivated her to seek community leadership, a genuine desire to serve her neighbors and make their shared home a better place to live. Election day dawned gray and drizzly, but by mid-morning the community center was buzzing with activity. Voter turnout was the highest in Willowbrook Gardens history, with residents lined up outside the door and animated conversations filling the hallways. Both candidates spent the day greeting voters, shaking hands, and making final appeals for support. Marcus remained confident and gracious, thanking people for their partnership.